I think someone in our comment section has it in for me because they asked me to do an episode on saturated fat, and would I please address Denise Minger and Nina Teicholz?
You're gonna need a bigger fire extinguisher.
Alrighty then, we're gonna have to go on a journey of discovery together because I really didn't know much about Denise, and it's been years since I heard Nina speak. But what I do know is no matter what I say, it's gonna set the comment section on fire! I have a personal interest in this because Trader Joe's 100% dark chocolate has a hold on me and it has a lot of saturated fat. I wonder what my doctor would say about that.
Back off on the chocolate, mister. I'll take that.
But Dr. Penny, the chocolate company says it has a special kind of saturated fat that will give me superpowers.
Actually, it tastes like dirt. You're not going to eat much of this?
Around 2010, Denise wrote a rebuttal to Colin Campbell's China study book that went mega viral. She was a 23-year-old English lit major who writes really well, and it's surprisingly authoritative with charts and references. My impression when I read it was, wow, it's great to see someone get obsessive about a book like this, and even better to see that people are taking the time to read her 9,000-word rebuttal and comment on it. I don't know if it helped or hurt sales of the book, which has gone viral too, but I respect the effort to go deep on it. And Dr. Campbell wrote a gracious response. I gave it a pretty thorough read at the time, but I had 3 concerns, so I moved on to other sources. Anyway, when I found out Denise wrote a book on the food pyramid, I thought, hey, good topic for her. Most people suspect there are some lobbying shenanigans behind the scenes that she could enlighten us on. She had gone low-fat raw vegan in high school and had lost muscle mass and fistfuls of hair in the shower and had gotten a foggy brain and a lot of cavities. Her doctor said she was low on B12 and iron, but she decided what she was really low on was critical thinking, and that's when she embarked on her journey of discovery. She starts her book by referencing acclaimed professor of nutrition Marion Nestle and her book Food Politics, and I thought, oh, you had me at Marion. If that's your source, I am all ears. All of Marion's books are first rate. As Denise was explaining how the American Food Guide is made, I was nodding, thinking yes, but just tell people to click over to Canada's. As Marion says, it's better. But Denise goes on to make the claim that America's is deadly. I know that's an attention grabber, but ours is very similar to countries like Hong Kong who outlive us. I can think of far worse food pyramids like the ones Americans actually eat. Let's make a food pyramid. The brand checks out. She says the missing element in our food pyramid is saturated fat, and that had its roots in experiments Russian scientists did in the early 1900s to clog bunny arteries. Shortly after, they expanded the test to rats and guinea pigs. Eesh, there is so much misinformation floating around the internet about that.
He took rabbits and he gave them animal fats, lots of it. They got atherosclerosis. The poor rabbits, their arteries clogged up. But remember, they're vegetarians.
Actually, scientists tested animals as close to human physiology as possible right up to the present day, and were especially active in the mid-1900s. I have one of many textbooks with chapters about how to give heart disease to dogs, pigs, monkeys, chickens, and even pigeons. Turns out swine are a lot like us. They're omnivores. They have very similar cholesterol distribution in terms of LDL and HDL. Pig heart parts are like human heart parts. My father-in-law has a pig heart valve in him. And you can feed them 25% saturated fat in some form like egg yolks or coconut oil, and they get atherosclerosis and die of heart attacks just like we do. I know, the poor pigs, but if it's any consolation, they seem to be treated more humanely than the pigs we raise for bacon. Those experiments led to the profound discovery that their arteries open back up when the amount of saturated fat is reduced in their feeds. Here's Stanford cardiologist David Marin giving a talk I attended.
So the inference is that they had really clogged up arteries. These monkeys had arteries that looked like this, and then they had regression, much less atherosclerosis.
Animal studies like that inspired a young Dean Ornish to try high plant, low saturated fat diets on humans, and voila! He showed our arteries can perform like the arteries of swine and monkeys and open back up when we ditch the saturated fat. Back to Denise, the plot is thickening. And despite the eventual clout that Anichkov's hypothesis gained, thinking about the Russian bunnies, it lay dormant for decades, lost as an unconnected dot in the heart disease saga until one man brought it back to the fore, a researcher named Ancel Keys. Honestly, I don't know how anyone could pack more misinformation into a single paragraph. These studies went on throughout the century and got a lot of attention. How times have changed for Ancel Keys. He introduced the world to the Mediterranean diet with his best-selling book in 1959, and he became a household name. Reading this cover story about him from Time magazine, you could tell how respected scientists were back then. That year, Time named scientists as Men of the Year. 40 years later, the science writer Gary Taubes concluded Ancel was one of the worst scientists ever after a single phone call.
When I got off the phone with this guy, I called up my editor at Science. I said, when I'm done doing the salt story, I'm going to do a fat story. I have no idea what the story is, but I know that if this guy was involved in any substantive way, there's a great story there.
Keys is Exhibit A behind the shoddy science claim in Denise's subtitle. I wondered what Marion would say about Ancel. So right in the beginning, you expressed some admiration for Ancel Keys.
I did.
Ancel and Margaret. And he's been sort of vilified all over the internet now. And I've tried to understand why he's so vilified. I mean, what's your perspective?
I don't know. To me, Ancel Keys is a great hero. He was an extraordinary researcher who did first-rate work in a number of fields. The 7-country study was only one of the many things that he did. He also was an expert on high-altitude physiology, oddly enough. He did a study of starvation during the Second World War that is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Nobody's ever gone anywhere near it in terms of its level of detail, quality. The findings from it still hold up extremely well.
Okay, that's a difference of opinion. We'll come back to Keys when we get to Nina's book because she has the same point of view as Gary and Denise do. Denise is no fan of large observational studies conducted over the years. One set are of the Adventists, who are largely vegetarian. In her telling, the co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen White, who survived a 3-week coma after being smashed in the head with a rock, was possessed by a vision from the Lord to have her followers abstain from meat. Denise could have told the story that Ellen attended the lectures of Sylvester Graham, a prominent vegetarian, and went on to oversee a religion with 200 hospitals, 7,800 schools and universities, some very prominent nutritional scientists, and a membership of 22 million of the longest-lived people on Earth, even when they live in industrialized cities like Los Angeles. Denise goes on to claim that observational studies show Seventh-day Adventists live no longer than Mormons, who, like the Adventists, don't drink or smoke, but whose founder never endured any meat abstinence visions. Ugh, these are such easy facts to check. Here's what Mormon founder Joseph Smith wrote about his meat abstinence vision in 1833. Yea, flesh also of beasts and of fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter, or of cold, or of famine. The church canonized that as part of their scriptures and referred to it as the word of wisdom. A long list of church presidents made statements like that. Brigham Young, fish is as healthy a food as we can eat if we accept vegetables and fruit, and with them will become a very wholesome diet. That was more than a century before Ancel became famous for saying the very same thing.
And when you speak about the diet, as I mentioned at that time anyway, the local diet, and what we thought was a good diet, was largely vegetarian. Fruits and vegetables and fish. Not many fish, actually.
Denise says both Adventist and Mormon men, once their birthday candles start numbering in the 30s, can expect to live about 7 years longer than the rest of the population, and she links to 2 observational studies. This one notes that the Mormon religion recommends a well-balanced diet, particularly the use of whole grains and fresh fruits and vegetables, and moderation in the eating of meat. The study was limited to the most faithful Mormon men. This one says, yes, the average Adventist lives 7 years longer than the general population, just like the most faithful Mormons. But not all Adventists are vegetarians. The men who are live an average of 9.5 years longer than the rest of the population. I was active Mormon for 35 years, and we held weekly healthy eating groups in my home for quite a while. My daughter is Mormon, and she's involved in plant-heavy Mormon Facebook healthy eating groups, as well as holding meetings in her home with women who read books like these. I was curious where Denise landed for her own diet if we can't trust scientists or the food pyramid, which is based on Ancel's Mediterranean diet. She spent a lot of time saying the observational studies of Weston Price influenced her. He was a dentist who in the early part of the 1900s observed how the invasion of Western foods among native populations wrecked their health and teeth. I think everyone agrees with that. But what does she actually eat?
I actually at this point believe that the lower fat end long term is probably going to create an overall healthier human being. And I know that's very controversial to say.
No, I don't believe
but I
it.
think the effects of a lower fat diet on the gut microbiome, I think the long-term effects on insulin sensitivity are going to be much better with lower fat diet. I think the benefit... Sorry, go ahead.
You're assuming that someone's following this. There's so many caveats. You can't be eating, because you can have low fat and have a terrible diet. So you
can. So I'm speaking more in terms of a whole food, plant-centered diet that has specifically chosen animal products that are high in nutrient density, but that are not high fat.
That sounds a lot like Ancel's Mediterranean diet, except based on a one-man non-rigorous study, instead of on a rigorous one with a whole team of international scientists. She said she devoted 2.5 years to writing her book, and I know that must sound like a lot to her, but compare that to getting 2 PhDs like Ancel Keys did, and devoting the rest of your 100-year life to doing actual science and writing many books. I was actually pulling for Denise because in the beginning she reminded me of Greta Thunberg, who isn't a scientist either. But Greta advocates for the scientific consensus, and Denise advocated against it in this book. That's a much tougher hill to climb. As a former Earth scientist, I can tell you Earth scientists have faced a plethora of science debunkers like Denise who are armed with the internet, who debunk them full time while the scientists try to stay focused on doing actual science. But in earth science, as in nutrition, the writings of debunkers who don't have a scientific background haven't aged well over the decades. Denise's book is published by Primal Nutrition, a Kraft Foods low-carb brand that sells supplements run by Mark Sisson, who has no scientific background either. Honestly, as much as I hate to hear these words come from my mouth, if I had a disinformation dozen list, this book would be on it. I hope you can tolerate some drama because Nina throws a lot of shade.
Keys did a lot of, there's hardly a better word for it than kind of saying fudging the data.
The expert community and all of our trusted public health institutions have ignored science, and they have been wrong about, they've basically ignored science and continued recommendations based on, weak data that has made Americans fat and sick. So, who would want to own that legacy? I surely would not.
Nina is a very well-educated journalist who has no scientific background either. But there are very well-respected journalists in nutrition like Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman who have no science. The difference is they have a ton of respect for scientists like Marion Nestle. Nina's book starts off where Denise's ended, with observational studies of populations like the Inuit and Maasai. Honestly, I kind of skimmed that chapter. Nina discounts observational studies anyway, and these are poorly studied populations who live quite different lifestyles from most of us. But in chapter 2, when she tackled a landmark study led by the most influential nutritional scientist of all time, she had my full attention. She went after Ancel early for his strong personality and propensity to disparage the work of people who opposed him. For example, Ancel called John Yudkin's opposing hypothesis a bag of nonsense. Oh, I know something about strong personalities because I spent a few years working for Steve Jobs. I told a story about that in my TEDx talk. He could really disparage. Working in Silicon Valley as I do, there are some strong personalities.
To anyone I've offended, I just want to say, I reinvented electric cars, and I'm sending people to Mars in a rocket ship. Did you think I was also going to be a chill, normal dude?
So what would Nina do if someone opposed her? Turns out Seth Yoder wrote a rebuttal to the big fat surprise like Denise did for the China study. He has a master's in human nutrition, however, and Seth's fact-checking was so thorough, it impressed the dean of Tufts School of Nutrition Science, so he tweeted out a link. Nina shot back that it was beneath him to tweet out a troll. Seth also impressed Marion, so she blogged about it. And Nina shot back that Marion should not have linked to a blogger's shoddy analysis who was just a fan of nutrition and who is mean and nasty. So Nina says you're a troll.
So did she say that on Twitter or something? I don't know. She blocked me like 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay, so Nina has a strong personality too. On to the science. She links to a chart Ancel published in 1953 showing a correlation between fat and cardiac death. He put 6 countries in the chart whose data he had some confidence in. 2 other respected scientists came along 4 years later, one a statistician, and they had data from a different source that included 22 countries and it had more scatter. Nina's conclusion that once you include 22 countries, there was no correlation. The moment I laid eyes on that chart, I thought, something is wrong. Can you see it? Mexico down here is in the realm of biologically implausible. 28 heart attack deaths per 100,000 doesn't seem possible. And it looks like there's quite a paradox in France. But these two scientists are talented, and no scientist would look at that data and say there's no correlation as Nina claimed. Surely they would question those lower data points too, at least Mexico and France. So I went to the source. And of course Yerushalmi and Hillebo said there was a correlation, but before they quantified it, they adjusted the data points that everyone could see were wonky. This was United Nations data, and they had several classifications for heart disease such as atherosclerosis, hypertension, and other diseases of the heart. Apparently, doctors in some countries like Mexico and France classified a lot of deaths in other diseases of the heart. So Yerushalmi and Hillebo combined classifications to produce a more believable chart. Here it is. Now Chile, France, and Mexico moved up to the plausible range, and France merged close to its neighbors. Turns out context is everything, and Ancel had spent a lot of time in Europe with his biochemist wife, Margaret, as he worked on his second PhD from Cambridge University. He also spent 2 years in Copenhagen working with the Nobel Prize-winning physiologist August Krogh. There is a wonderful book describing how Margaret brought her cholesterol testing kit in their travels to places like Italy, Finland, Japan, and South Africa.
And my father insisted that my mother be part of the work that he did all those years, even though she didn't have any official title or...
They would observe local diets and patients in hospitals. You can easily see why he would be mistrustful of United Nations data, especially from countries like Mexico, Chile, France, and Sri Lanka. In any case, Yerushalmi and Hillebo actually published two charts side by side. The left is about rising heart attack risk as fat consumption increased, and on the right, how heart attacks went up with increased consumption of animal protein, an even stronger correlation. I can see why, if the subtitle of your book is that meat and cheese belong in a healthy diet, you wouldn't want to include that second chart, which Nina didn't. I can especially see why you wouldn't want to include this table, which shows a strong correlation between animal fat and protein with heart attacks, but a negative correlation with vegetable fat and protein. But the call to action from this paper was for more tests because this data was shaky and those correlations don't prove causation. And that set up what happened next, Ancel Keys' famous 7 countries study. Suppose you're Ancel staring at this chart. No one had done a large multi-country, multi-language study like this, and for every new area you study, you have to assemble a significant team and raise money to support them. So you can only choose a manageable number of locations. How do you choose? Well, you better choose Japan to see what's going on there, and for sure Finland and the US, which are off the charts. You better include some high-fat consuming areas who don't have a lot of heart attacks. And if you're really smart, you're thinking, hey, in 35 years they're going to invent the internet and it's going to become conspiracy central, especially in America. So we better pick some locations where we have no idea what the heart attack rate is, like Dalmatia and Slavonia, lest people lose their minds and think we cherry-picked. If you're thinking, hey, it doesn't look like a lot of critics of Ancel's like Nina ever read Yerushalmi and Hillebo's paper, imagine how many haven't read Keys' 1980 book on the 7-country study, or who haven't explored the dozen other books on the 7-country study, like Lessons for Science from the 7-country study, a 35-year experience in cardiovascular disease epidemiology. They tried to pick small rural communities with strong community organizers so they could get almost all the men to participate to eliminate selection bias that would occur if some opted out. They had to coordinate how they did food assays, blood tests, and determinations of cause of death across all 16 areas in all those languages, a mammoth task that took years to plan. Nina complains that the initial findings were published in the Dutch journal Voting.
And he published it in obscure German-only journals. I had to go back to obscure places. He really didn't want this data to get out.
Really? Voting was a highly respected journal among nutrition scientists. Ancel had published there before. This was primarily a European study, and one of the cohorts was in the Netherlands. I'll tell you who did see it. The Finns. My first trip to London was in 1980, and when I turned on the BBC, a TV news reporter said,
"The Exchequer of the government has released the latest life expectancy numbers, and Finnish men are no longer at the bottom, having overtaken Scottish men. Italian men are still atop the ranking by a rather large margin."
When the Finns realized one of the 7-country study areas, the beautiful North Karelia area of Finland, had the highest heart attack rates in the world, they selected a 27-year-old doctor to lead a team to turn it around. He wrote this amazing book 20 years later. He's now 75.
At that time, we knew much less about what causes heart disease, but already the classical work by Ancel Keys and a number of others had indicated that there are some very strong risk factors that are really very likely causal. Ancel Keys had shown in his classical studies that blood cholesterol is so strongly determined by what we eat, and particularly on the quality of fat.
Using another area of Finland as a control group, they went on an interventional campaign against the saturated fats in animal foods. They worked with media, local restaurants, butchers, bakeries, and started initiatives like Dairies to Berries, where they converted dairy farms into berry farms. Once they saw how dramatic the changes came and how quickly, the control group joined the changes and it swept all of Finland. It's a fascinating book, and they tried to measure and report everything. For example, in 1972, over 80% of people in North Karelia put butter on their bread. But by 1993, it was closer to 10%. They made a food pyramid where fruit and veggies dominate, and they cut way back on meat, butter, and cheese. And the results were astonishing. An 80% drop in death by heart attack among middle-aged men. The director of the project was Pekka Puska, who went on to become Director General of Finland's National Institute of Health, President of the World Heart Federation, member of the Finnish Parliament, and Chancellor of Turku University in Finland. He was gracious enough to accept my invitation for an interview in a few weeks because I have questions. Like, how did they get macho Finnish men to cut back on meat consumption? Spoiler, they appealed to the women in the men's lives. After transforming his nation's health, raising their life expectancy to more than 3.5 years longer than America's, I feel like he could give his book a more exciting title, like Life by Food Pyramid. I bring the Finnish study up because Nina opens many of her speeches saying she doesn't believe in epidemiology like the 7-country study.
You know, first of all, I don't believe in epidemiological studies.
And nutritional epidemiology is particularly fraught because it depends on people reporting what they ate. So just imagine this. So every 6 months you get a questionnaire. How many apples did you eat?
That's why the 7-country study didn't rely on questionnaires. They assayed the food the men actually ate over 7 days in various seasons. That seasons detail was critical.
He went up to Crete, the island of Crete, 3 times for 3 weeks, each 1 week, 3 times. One of his data collection periods was during Lent, it turns out. So I don't know if you know about Lent, but it's a highly Greek Orthodox country, and in Lent, you don't eat any animal foods. You don't eat any meat, you don't eat dairy, you don't eat... So this totally skewed his data.
I would have been critical if they hadn't collected data during Lent. Good science demands it because if you don't collect the data, you don't know if you're missing something. As it turned out, the data showed it didn't make much difference because adherence to Lent was light in the rural areas that they studied.
There's all that data that you see about red meat. Again, that's from epidemiological studies. Those red meat eaters, they're tiny associations. They're 1.2, 1.3. The study that you had up there was the ones about low-carb diets being bad, all tiny. They're 1.2 or 1.3. Just to give you a sense of where epidemiology can say something interesting, it's like smoking and lung cancer. That's a difference of 35-fold. We're talking about differences of 1 or 1.2, 1.3. Even the National Cancer Institute itself said that below 2, below a level of 2, these are talking about relative risks, that it's not even worth considering.
Well, in the 7-country study, the difference in heart attack rates among different countries was tenfold. Scientists know there are limitations to large observational studies, but they don't throw out a large treasure trove of carefully acquired data. They compare them to other studies like clinical trials because each has strengths and weaknesses and they complement each other. Dr. Puska took the observations of the 7-country study and turned it into an interventional study. I don't know why Nina didn't include that in her book. That's why you pick good studies like 7 countries, because the results are consistent with Dr. Puska's interventional data from Finland, Dr. Armstrong's laboratory experiments on animals, etc. This book took me so much longer to read than any book I can remember because I felt the need to check references so often. I found quotes like, in short, to avoid fat, people should eat sugar, the American Heart Association advised. I don't know who believes references like that. Nutrition experts have been telling us to avoid sugar since at least Sylvester Graham in the mid-1800s. But she referenced a 1995 pamphlet. I found it, and you have to scroll past the recommendations to eat 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day, to the special occasions only in snack sections, and skip over the advice to snack on vegetables with low-fat dressing, fruit, unsalted popcorn. It's true they didn't forbid a small amount of sugar, but context. Or her reference to a report by the American Institute for Cancer Research that found that in no case was the evidence for consumption of fruits and vegetables in the prevention of cancer judged to be convincing. I checked that reference too. It's because they have 3 levels of evidence and convincing is the very highest. But there sure were a lot of fruits and vegetables in the next 2 levels. Probable, which they define as strong evidence, and suggestive. She also didn't show the recommendations to cut back on red and processed meat. She's a good promoter, and the book was recommended by quite a few prestigious publications. After checking its references, I wondered how that was possible. I think the answer to that question was published by respected scientists in The Lancet. Reviewers should have checked the references. Hardly anyone ever does. I decided to watch some of her speeches and debates because she's everywhere, but I couldn't stop asking myself, what is her why? Why is she doing this? I can understand the why for vegans who want to save the planet, for people like Pekka Puska who felt he could transform the health of a nation with the Mediterranean diet, even low-carbers who believe it's the ticket to big weight loss. But what's hers? She's not promoting the environment or animal welfare. She's not doing science. She's not seeing patients. She doesn't sell a weight loss plan. Is it because she gets to be a respected expert?
So there's actually a whole chapter in my book on the Mediterranean diet. I think that I probably know more about that than anybody on the planet.
That's a good explanation of the state of nutrition science. If you can write a chapter in a book and throw shade on scientists, you can be the planet's expert, or at least the internet's.
There are people who can write about sports, and they know a lot more about the sports than the baseball players themselves who are out on the field doing it.
I didn't know that applied to sports too. I thought to gain the knowledge to win a championship, you had to play the game at a high level with the best players. And I thought to advance science, you had to do science. Speaking of doing science on the Mediterranean diet, Henry Blackburn. He's been a key scientist on the team since the beginning, so I reached out to him for an interview. He wrote back, "You're the YouTube star, Chris. I'm 96 and beyond such doings." He was out traveling with his wife, but he linked me to a treasure trove of films he shot in 1958 when the study began, and he was prepping for YouTube stardom. Here he is as Anthony Bourdain.
This is our breakfast. These anchovies being baked over coals. I ate heartily until I saw a companion lift the edge of the skin and noticed that the flesh was full of ascarids still wiggling. I went over in the corner and lost my breakfast and haven't eaten an anchovy since. Fish is the main source of protein, occasional goat, no cattle on the coast, plant food diet predominantly. They were still living as they'd lived for millennia with this sort of transportation. We were fortunate to arrive at this time where people were living as they had traditionally for centuries. It was soon to change.
Where else can you find such carefully collected data on the very same people as more animal and processed foods entered their diets over the next 50 years? The extended team of 7 country study scientists got together after 35 years, and I was riveted by reading the changes they saw. New drugs, new surgical procedures, Cheetos, beef jerky, rising cholesterols and blood pressure. Remember the crude United Nations data the Yerushalmi and Hillebo charts were based on? The 7 countries' data acquired after that paper was published is probably 1,000 times more accurate and useful. These Mediterranean diet scientists are like the Energizer Bunny. Jeremiah Stamler, who's now 101 and still directing a team of scientists funded by the NIH, summarized the 35-year conference by noting that despite all the changes, one thing hadn't changed. The population who managed to keep their blood pressure and cholesterol low through diet, a much smaller portion of the population, had dramatically lower incidence of heart disease, strokes, diabetes, and cancer. Nina speaks at cattlemen's conferences, and she's so consistent with the talking points of the beef industry, I couldn't help but wonder if money is involved. She has said after spending 9 years on her book, the royalties only come out to be equivalent to a kindergarten teacher's salary. But I noticed the nutrition coalition she started is funded by a Texas hedge fund billionaire. And according to public records, her salary is $144,000. Her coalition seems to have hired the lobbying firm S3 that represents the Koch brothers and Juul, the vaping company. Her coalition's stated mission is to promote better science, but in almost every message they mainly criticize science and slip in a promotion of saturated fat.
The failures of science and policymaking that I discovered through that investigation compelled me to create the Nutrition Coalition. Multiple trials did not confirm that a diet restricted in fat or saturated fat could protect against diet-related diseases.
And in the case of the respected nutrition professor Joanne Sabate, she is saying he's conflicted because he's a Seventh-day Adventist and his religious views are in conflict with meat. Does that mean we'll be excluding Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and Mormons for animal foods they don't eat? Her coalition is not doing or funding science. She spends full time speaking and lobbying, running the beef industry playbook, saying the science is shoddy and confusing. The guidelines made us fat and we need more beef, butter, and cheese in our diets. Her talking points sound like they were crafted by a lobbying group. The plant-based doctors like Neil Bernard, Colin Campbell, and Michael Greger all ate a lot of meat before the science convinced them to go plant-based. When they publish something, her answer is always you have to ignore them because they are vegan activists and therefore biased. Those two words, vegan activists, are words a lobbying group would use to stir up emotion and conjure images of someone blocking traffic with a sign about animal rights. On the rare occasion when she's asked, "What evidence do you have that meat is healthy?" she doesn't seem to have a compelling script.
Any evidence that you could cite that meat diets are healthier than plant-based diets?
The clinical trials on meat specifically are, there's 2 systematic reviews of clinical trials on meat that I know of that show that cardiovascular outcomes are improved. One of them looked at 0.5 ounces or servings of meat per day and showed increased benefits, cardiovascular benefits for eating the meat versus not eating the meat. And there is one other review on cardiovascular outcomes that also showed that meat was beneficial, looked better for cardiovascular outcomes.
So if a hedge fund billionaire and a lobbying firm whose modus operandi is science denial is the basis of the new food guide, what are we to do? Scientists don't have the time, money, or inclination to lobby back. One thing we can do is click over to Canadian or Finnish food guides. As far as I know, doctors like Pekka Puska control them, not hedge fund billionaires. And we can read books from celebrated scientists that Nina's coalition hasn't attacked yet, like Elizabeth Blackburn, the Nobel Prize winner. She showed via some pretty hard-to-dispute science, telomeres, that Ancel's Mediterranean diet is the way to health. Or Dr. William Lee, who lit up the big stage at TED with a sensational talk about progress in beating cancer. He explains how 60 years of science since Ancel Keys first promoted the plant-heavy Mediterranean diet explains why it's so healthy. The interesting thing about Dr. Lee is he's fine with some animal foods in the diet as long as they don't include red or processed meat. But if you have a serious condition like lupus or multiple sclerosis, then he says you might need to go 100% plant-based. Or you could just ask Marion.
By this time, I think we know what a healthy diet is. Food, not too much, mostly plants. I once asked the question, why wasn't he Nobel Prize winning? Why wasn't he extolled with, fantastic awards and honors? We're still talking about the Mediterranean diet, and that was his construct.
Marion is such a jewel. I'll post the complete interview when I get a chance. We only had 30 minutes. Thank you so much for watching that marathon episode. I don't like to do debunking episodes, but this one seemed important. If you're watching this on Plant-Based News, I hope you'll like and subscribe to their channel because they are awesome. I wonder what my doctor would think about that.
I'll take that. Back off on the... Oh, okay. I messed that up.